Hello, hi, and welcome to the second episode of the Curiosity Conversations. Whether you're listening or whether you're watching via YouTube, we just love that you're with us. This is your invitation to listen into our conversation and to begin to get curious. And today I am with my brilliant friend, Laura Edwards. Hi, Laura.
Hi.
Hello. Laura is a trainee psychologist. She qualifies in August. Exciting times, yay. After studying, is it since 2013 that you've been studying?
Yeah, I started my undergrad psychology in 2013, so it feels like it's been quite a long journey.
Wow, you're going to have some serious letters after your name, but it's really good to have you with us today. Laura also is part of the leadership team of Ignite Church in Lincoln, along with her husband Darren, and they do some amazing work into the community, really blessing people. But today, me and Laura are talking about lots of things around mental health, anxiety, and particularly health anxiety. Because do you know, Laura, what point I knew we were going to be friends is when you admitted that you too, as a child, used to read the Reader's Digest Family Medical and diagnose yourself with many things.
Many
we were destined to be friends. So I'd love just for you to maybe introduce yourself a little bit more if you want, and just to chat about your journey so far, particularly with managing anxiety, thought life, and we are looking specifically at health anxiety today. And we want this to be quite a light-hearted conversation because we've got some funny stories, haven't we? But also really aware that this is hard for people, that people are dealing with some big things at the moment. 2020 has been a hard year.
Absolutely. And, you know, when you asked me, when we were thinking about the topic for this conversation, I kind of thought to myself, oh, wow, I don't know if I really struggle with health anxiety anymore. And then I remembered immediately that back in August, we'd got back from holiday and my cat was just acting a bit more familiar and clingy, which obviously is because we've been away for a week. I started Googling cat behaviour and decided that he'd probably got rabies and that I probably would have it too because he scratches and bites me all the time. So, yeah, maybe I think it's kind of an ongoing journey, definitely. But yeah, I guess my journey with kind of anxiety and health anxiety really dates right back, obviously, to when I was really young. And I guess, as you pointed out, Jo, I was really inquisitive, a really kind of interested, curious child, I guess. And I read lots and lots of different things. And when I'd finished reading all my things, I'd go downstairs and my mum had quite like a modest bookshelf in the lounge, which was mainly filled with Disney VHS videos, but
videos, brilliant.
And some 70s cookbooks actually, with like trifle and duck à l'orange and
classic Delia Smith. Brilliant. Everything you need for a 70s dinner party.
Definitely. But once I'd learnt and perfected how to make blancmange, I moved on to we had this giant medical encyclopedia that I think my great nan had passed down that was full of like Victorian ailments essentially, and it had fantastic pictures in it of people with mumps and diagrams of like
yours had pictures in it, did it?
Yes.
Oh gosh, even worse.
Probably worse, but they were great pictures, and an iron lung, and there was a picture of patients with TB in beds outside the sanatorium and all of that kind of stuff. And so I learned at about probably younger than 10 years old, probably, about lots and lots of sort of mysterious illnesses. And I guess alongside that, I was a sickly child anyway. I'd had quite a lot of difficulties. I think I was probably lactose intolerant, but they didn't really detail that back then. And I guess on top of that as well, understandably, my mum was really overly attentive because I was poorly quite a lot. So she was really kind of vigilant of illness. And so I guess I learned 3 really important messages very early on, which was, because of this encyclopedia, that the world was a scary, dangerous, disease-ridden place, that I was vulnerable to all of these poorlies, and that we needed to be really aware and really careful, which kind of, I guess, came more from mum. Which really is the perfect concoction, if you imagine, to kind of go on to develop sort of ongoing concerns about health and and fears about that. And I guess throughout my life, as I look back, I didn't really realise that I had problems with anxiety or health anxiety particularly until maybe even 10 years ago, when I fully understood what was happening. You know, that realisation, which is often really reassuring, that, oh my gosh, I'm not mad, this is a thing.
Yeah.
This is the thing that other people struggle with as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess that was just probably in 2013, I had a really kind of unpleasant blip where I'd finished, we'd kind of had a lot of traumatic things that happened. We'd moved house, which is not traumatic, but there'd been some death in the family. Liam, who was probably about 10 at the time, had an accident where he's knocked off his bike. Lots of things happened that made me feel I wasn't in control. And along that, at the same time as that, I'd gone into the summer break from university. And so I basically had a good 6-week period of time where I was left alone with my thoughts, which you can see where that went. Yeah, and so by the end of the summer, my life had shrunk so much. I wasn't even driving myself anymore. I was scrubbing the house. So there was, you know, lots of, you can see how things that we label as disorders often blend into one another. So there's lots of like OCD behaviours and scrubbing, and I'd become completely obsessed that I either had or was going to develop some terrible sort of flesh-eating bacteria. And I think when I say that now, as somebody that I feel like I'm quite logical and rational sort of person, I can see that, oh gosh, why was I thinking those things? Yeah. But at the time I was completely consumed by it, really. And so went and had some CBT myself to kind of overcome that. But yeah, it's just been up and down really. Since then, I feel a lot more confident today that I wouldn't potentially get back into that position. I think because of the skills and techniques I've learned, and obviously through my own training and work with other people. But like I said, back in August, I was still concerned that we might, as a family, have rabies. So.
Well, you know, I can absolutely relate to this. And this is why, as much as issues around health can be very emotive and some people are carrying some big things, and I know that you're working with some end-of-life patients at the minute, but so we don't want to diminish it, but at the time, some of these things that are quite silly can seem very real. So the rabies thing, I got bit by our guinea pig a couple of weeks ago. And the first thing I did was Google, can guinea pigs give you rabies? Because it felt really real for me at the time. And that's why I love the idea of talking about this and almost normalizing it. So we can say, like you realized, okay, I'm not mad. I'm not totally out of control. This is a thing and I'm not alone in it. And also that they're, like you said, and I'd love to come on to this at some point, there are techniques, there are strategies, there are things that we can use that will talk us down and kind of give us that perspective. Because off the back of the last Curiosity conversation, little plug there if you haven't listened to it, but around hormones and all that kind of stuff, there are certain times of the month for me where I feel less in control and like my mind can catastrophize a lot more, and that's often when I start thinking about these things. Is that the case for you?
Absolutely. And just to go back to, I think Sally's message on the last podcast and the last video was so helpful. Even, you know, I'm working with people and I've been telling people this week about the hormone cycle and the changes during that. So it's fantastic info. But yeah, absolutely. So there will be times when you are naturally feeling more on edge and more anxious, just due to sort of different chemicals in the body and levels of hormones and that kind of stuff. But I think particularly now as well at the moment, as we're in kind of this COVID season, and lots of people are furloughed, lots of people are at home, or we might have been homeschooling our children. And so we are kind of face to face, I guess, with that knowledge that we're maybe not as in control as we thought we were, which kind of naturally would make us more anxious anyway. But yeah, adding to that, there's definitely times when in the months and throughout it, when I notice peaks and troughs just in my underlying levels of anxiety. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And what you mentioned earlier about kind of your first realization as a child that you weren't necessarily in control, that there were things that could happen. And often that's a hard realization, isn't it? Is like, I'm not in control. And often, do you wonder, or have you got any thoughts around whether health anxiety is always about the actual symptom, or whether it's about something that's going on in us that kind of outworks itself in health anxiety?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I guess to start with, all anxiety is essentially related to a similar kind of appraisal. And so all anxiety relates to us overestimating the threat, whether that's a physical symptom or the world outside us, and underestimating our ability to cope with the threat, essentially. And so a lot of the time, anxiety is about our appraisals of what we think of ourselves, whether we think we're good at coping, or whether we feel we've got this scary image of ourselves as being vulnerable or weak. But yeah, also kind of over noticing threats outside. And I think for me, I think a lot of the time, particularly when I'm working with other people as well, health anxiety is never just about one thing. It's never just about the physical symptoms. There's fears about, sometimes about death or about suffering, or particularly if we've got children or we're responsible for kind of elderly family members maybe, or somebody that's sick. We've not just got to take care of our own physical health. We're worried about what will happen if we're ill to the people around us that we care about. But yeah, also just tying into that lack of control as well. And often, if we've got a kind of an ongoing underlying anxiety, sometimes the trigger for sort of a bit of a vicious cycle will be those times when we suddenly realise we're not in control. Particularly like the COVID lockdown, or sometimes if something, I guess for me, looking back to my episode in 2013, the fact that we'd lost family members and Liam had that accident, it kind of removes that false sense of security that we all have, that everything's going along as normal. So yeah, definitely it's never just about the symptom. There's always other things going on.
So you'd say that any anxiety that people might be feeling has the same root cause, that it's in this kind of rooted in the same. I love that phrase. What did you use about overestimating and underestimating?
Yeah, so overestimating the threat and underestimating our ability to cope. And essentially the development of that comes from experiences usually that we've had in childhood or throughout our lives, where maybe, even when we have memories, we often remember things being worse than they were or more difficult than they were, because we're naturally sort of drawn to filtering out the positive and clinging on to the negative. And so we have.
Why do we do that? Come on, you as a psychologist, tell us, why do we do that? Why do we tend to cling on to the negative or catastrophize? Because I don't know about you, but a lot of my thoughts around health, or just generally if I'm feeling a bit out of control, are all around catastrophizing and worst case scenario. So we'll always go to the worst case scenario. Why do you think we do that? Is it self-protection?
Yeah, it is. It's protective strategy. And I think it's just that sometimes we get in a cycle where it becomes a bit unhelpful. So, and I love the fact that this podcast and this series is called the Curiosity Conversation, because curiosity is kind of the positive sister of anxiety.
Oh, I love that. What a great thing. That should be the tagline. I wish I'd heard that earlier. Can you unpack that a bit for us? What do you mean by that?
So essentially, anxiety is kind of our protective system. So I think sometimes we beat ourselves up for anxiety, but actually anxiety is a mechanism that's in us to protect us from danger, and we need it, and it's a good thing. It just gets a bit out of control sometimes, and it sometimes overtakes when we are struggling. But curiosity is essentially, if anxiety is asking, what if something awful happens? Curiosity asks us what good could happen, or what can I learn from this? What new things are there? And I think often anxiety robs us of curiosity, because when we are anxious, our life shrinks and we avoid things, which means we lose out on a lot of learning that we could do. So, for instance, I'm a terrible one for this, but if we are going to attend a party and we have this fear that it's going to be overwhelming and that I'm going to make a fool of myself, definitely something I do a lot. that anxiety, if we then don't attend the party because of the anxiety, we don't do that learning that actually we probably would have been all right, the party probably would have been good or okay or manageable. So we kind of miss out on the learning. But yeah, so curiosity is the antidote. So it's really lovely that that's the name of this podcast, and that's what we're doing together.
I love that. I absolutely love that. So yeah, curiosity as an antidote to anxiety. I also realize have heard before, and I think we've had a conversation before about how another good antidote to anxiety is gratitude. Kind of grounding yourself in the practice of gratitude. And I love, we're both women of faith, we both love God, we're both involved in local church. And I really love how science is always catching up with scripture, that we have these brilliant kind of breakthroughs in science. And then you think, oh no, I've read that. I've read that before in my Bible. I've read it. God's given us some information on that, particularly this thing around gratitude, about not being anxious for anything, but instead of praying and practicing gratitude. We see that in Philippians 4, and I love it. And then off the back of that, I heard that your brain's kind of not able to be anxious and grateful at the same time. So again, it's an antidote. Can you tell us a bit more?
Yeah, so I guess in all of us, we've got these two systems working alongside one another, and we call them the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous systems. And so when we're anxious or when we notice a threat, in the center of the brain, there's an area called the amygdala, which fires off as like a warning sign, and our bodies release adrenaline and cortisol, and essentially that's getting us ready for the fight, flight or freeze response, essentially in order to protect us. But as we know, often when that goes off, we're kind of not actually in a dangerous situation. So we just end up we get all them physical symptoms of feeling sick, dizzy, heart pounding, which if you've struggle with health anxiety, we then reinterpret as being something problematic. So we're actually reinterpreting our anxiety symptoms.
Well, that happens, doesn't it? Often people go to A&E thinking they're having a heart attack and they're having a panic attack, or it's that cortisol flooding their body.
Absolutely. And so we get in that cycle. We reinterpret the anxiety symptoms as more symptoms of illness, which then add to our original anxieties. I've done that cycle many, many times. But actually, when we're practicing, I guess, gratitude and curiosity, it's the other system, the parasympathetic system, that we're activating. I don't know if people would like to have a look at, there's something called polyvagal theory, which is about learning ways to activate that system. And practicing gratitude is great because then we're really activating things. When we think about the things that we're grateful for and we're happy about, and we're thankful for, we focus in on things that are usually quite calming, and our bodies release positive hormones, oxytocin and serotonin and things that actually bring our anxious state down. And so what you've talked about when we practice gratitude, that is a very cognitive skill, isn't it? Thinking about things that we're grateful for. But there's also physical ways that you can activate the system as well, which, as I guess I've learned along training, we don't put enough emphasis on. But it's that the physical and the psychological and the behavioural are so interlinked and connected that,
It's amazing, isn't it, how God's made us, this kind of body, soul and spirit, that it's so holistic, more so than maybe we, like you say, than we realise. And then there's certain verses that I think, God's just bringing us to a place of peace again. I love this verse, Psalm 46, be still and know that I'm God. Just in that kind of being still, that activates that, is it the parasympathetic system? Is that what it's called? And just by the breathing, just the Yahweh, the Ruach, the breathing in and the breathing out. I love that the Holy Spirit is literally the breath of God. And there's something about the breathing then that just calms us down again. I love that.
In fact, breathing techniques, God knows, doesn't he? Breathing techniques are actually one of the most effective techniques. They're written off the most quickly because I think lots of people have been told in the past to slow down their breathing without the rationale behind it or without understanding the feedback loop with the brain. But actually what happens when we consciously slow our breathing down and breathe deeply from the stomach instead of the chest. When we're anxious or when we're panicking, we take short, sharp breaths, which lowers the carbon dioxide in our blood and makes us dizzy, and we get strange, which then makes us more anxious because we're going to pass out or something, right? Which we're probably not. But slowing down the breathing brings the levels back together, and it also feeds back to the brain that we're safe. Whether we really think we're safe or not, it's like our lungs can trick our brain. So those breathing exercises are actually really valuable, but I think understandably we think, oh gosh, don't just tell me to breathe slower. There's more going on.
It's knowing the rationale, isn't it? Often we're told to do these things, but maybe we're not aware of like what's actually happening in our brain. And I guess that kind of like amygdala stuff that you're talking about, where the fight, the fright, the flee, freeze, all that kind of stuff, that has a very real effect on our body, doesn't it?
Yes.
So I guess when we're catastrophizing, and I was speaking to a lovely, lovely friend the other day, and she was talking about how she was just in her thoughts, she was thinking and catastrophizing something so much that she made herself sick, that it had such an impact. And I guess that we can't underestimate that our just being in the car and kind of catastrophizing what might happen, or thinking about something and getting to that place where we begin to feel our heart racing, just a very real effect. And then it's actually robbing us from the thing that we're worried about losing in the first place, our peace, our health, all that kind of thing.
I remember when I was having CBT, and my therapist said to me at the time, bearing in mind I was really concerned about a sort of flesh-eating disease it was a really rare disease, and she said to me that it had struck her that I was spending 99% of my day absolutely consumed by something that had less than a 0.00001% chance of happening. And we know that's not the same with all different other illnesses and stuff, but it really resonated with me in terms of actually, no matter what the illness is and no matter how likely it is that I have or haven't got this thing, I'm not having a meaningful life at the moment. Because I'm consumed by it. So how can I make that shift? And it really did have a shift in my thinking to carry on living and carry on doing all the things that are making me anxious, and learn to tolerate the anxiety levels at the side, but still continue to live, essentially.
Yeah, that's such wise advice, because it can just really rob us, can't it? If we insist on, I guess it's ruminating, that our brain was designed to meditate on good stuff, on truth, on stuff that brings life and joy and peace. But when we ruminate and go round and round in circles, why is it so easy to ruminate on the negative and not to kind of focus on the good? And have you got any tips of how we focus on the good stuff, how we can train our brain to do that?
Yes, absolutely. I think, again, it comes down to that protective, it's nature. It's about wanting to, often when we are people particularly that ruminate on the negative, and I think most of us would fall into that camp, again, it's often because we've had negative experiences before and we want to do as much as we can to protect ourselves. And so our brain is kind of trying to help us do that by ruling out all of the possible worst case scenarios. And the problem with that is that when we start thinking about all of those worst case scenarios, it makes us feel absolutely rotten. And all of those things are very unlikely to happen anyway, usually. And also, I don't know if this might be helpful for anybody, but at the moment I'm working in psycho-oncology, and so I'm working with lots of individuals who are really poorly, and some that are terminally ill, and some who are young people, but actually despite that, they are, all of them, with very limited support from me, I'd add, coping really well and coping better than they anticipated they would in this kind of situation. And I think when we go to that worst case scenario, we imagine that we're not going to cope and we're not going to manage. But what we know is that actually, even if the very worst happened, we would cope a lot better than we think we would. And things would be okay. As awful as that, might sound, things will be okay. And I guess that shift from, it takes a lot of work to begin to notice our thoughts. But I think over my own journey and my training and everything else, I've learned to stop myself when I'm feeling rubbish. and query why I'm feeling rubbish, because I think our thoughts travel so quickly and we often get so caught up in having a conversation in our minds, you know, or reliving something or whatever it is. But as soon as I notice that either I'm feeling anxious, often it'll be in the car, like you just said, actually, Jo, when I'm driving, if I've got a long journey, I might get halfway there and suddenly think I'm feeling really anxious or upset about something. Then I can now step aside and say, what is it that I'm thinking about? So you just have that disconnect for a second from your thoughts, because what we're all kind of really entwined and enmeshed in our thoughts a lot of the time. And something that can really improve well-being is just the ability to disconnect us from the thoughts, to step back and say, what is it I'm thinking about that's making me feel like this? And have I got it in me at the moment to shift my attention somewhere else? And sometimes when the thoughts are really powerful, you need to kind of use physical things, so smells, and really ground yourself using your like physical environment as kind of as an anchor point, I guess. But if you're not feeling too bad, I think I find it now quite easy to shift my thinking. And I've got like a bank of really lovely memories that I've really spent time developing, that I can shift into and actually notice over a few minutes my mood and my feelings and my physical being change.
That's such a great insight. Thank you. And I love that phrase, our thoughts travel first, that we think them and then they begin to affect like our body, our soul, our spirit. They affect the whole of us. And I guess there's real freedom, isn't there, in realizing that we don't have to think about what we're thinking about. Just because we think about it, we can notice it. And I guess then, does something real happen in your brain then when you just notice this thought and you kind of, I guess you switch, you talk to us about the amygdala, that kind of very middle part of your brain, fight, flight, freeze stuff. I guess then we switch out of that fight. It's hard to say that, isn't it? Fight or flight. I'll just say that. Fight or flight, and into kind of like our front part of our brain where we can do our best thinking, where we can relate to people. Because I notice when I'm kind of ruminating and I'm feeling in that fight, flight bit, I find it hard to be in the moment with people. I find it hard to have conversations. I find it hard to feel empathy maybe for people. I find it hard to have my best relationships in that time because I'm too busy in my head catastrophizing all the things that might happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we imagine the brain is actually like, it's kind of in two parts. So this part is like the bit where the amygdala is, and it's the back, the brainstem, and that's where all of the emotional, not the emotional processing as such, but this is where the threat system exists. So this is like the primal bit of the brain that will save your life if you're in danger. And this is the bit that, you know, if a bus is coming and you've just stepped out into the road, you don't have time to plan and think about what to do. This fires and drags you out of the road physically. Your body just does it automatically. And then we've got this other layer on top, which is our frontal lobes, which is our personality, our thinking, our processing, our ability to empathise. It all sits on top. And when we're really anxious or experiencing kind of in a real sort of traumatic place, these two parts of the brain, we know, don't communicate with each other because this bit takes over and makes decisions for us, essentially, about survival. And so that's why when this is firing at 100 rates per minute or whatever, this front bit isn't connected. So we can't really make good decisions when we're really anxious. We can't connect with other people properly when we're really anxious. And when we're in that place, the best way to bring the two parts back together is actually sometimes not to try and change our thoughts because it's just too difficult if we're really in that rumination cycle, but to engage in some of the more physical, calming techniques, such as slowing the breathing down. Just slowing your breathing down can reconnect the two parts of the brain, and then give yourself, that might give you the space then to say, oh, hang on, what am I thinking? Let me step outside my thoughts for a moment and see if I can change direction. But actually, a lot of the time, for people that really struggle with anxiety and worry, learning that they can control, they do have some control over the anxiety and the worry can really be a game changer. And there's techniques that people can look up, like the postponement technique for anxiety, which is really great for teaching people they're in control. which is where, you know, I'd carry a notebook around with me for a while when I was really struggling, and note down every time I noticed myself ruminating about my health, and I'd just make a note of what it was that I was worrying about. And I would promise myself, and you have to kind of stick to it, that every afternoon at say 4:30 or whatever time is suitable, I'd go and sit, and then I would work through those worries and allow myself to work through them and to feel the worry and to do a bit of problem solving. You know, can I do anything about that one? How can I learn to let go of it if I can't? And then at the end of that half an hour, that would be it for the day. And then I would have to wait then to allow myself to really ruminate and get in that place until the same time the next day, and just note down things in between. And what I learned very quickly was, which I hadn't predicted at all, I learned quickly to trust myself that I would come back to it, which gave me the space to let go of it in the moment and enjoy what I was doing, or listen to the person I was talking to, or enjoy my dinner.
That's so good. That's really good, and quite freeing, isn't it, I guess, because anxiety can just rob us of good conversations, good meals, nice times with people. Even watching a nice film, we just can be robbed of that stuff, can't we, when we find those thoughts coming up again. Yeah. So what's that, the postponement technique? We postpone it.
Yeah.
Clever. That's so good. I'm so grateful for people like you who've just studied all of this stuff. And I think there's just so much hope in these conversations. When you're just talking about our brain, I'm thinking God has knitted us together so brilliantly and so beautifully, and given us all the techniques that we need to live in a place of peace. But I guess this anxiety stuff's really real. It's really real for some people, for a lot of us, some more than others. But how do you think 2020's played out for people? And even for you, how have you found it personally?
Yeah, I guess, well, personally, I've been really blessed in that actually I've been able, I've just realised I said blessed. I've been privileged to be in a position that I can work from home. So I'm continuing to work at the moment. And for me, that routine has been really important. And I know for myself that routine is very important, and having a structure to my day.
Yeah.
Literally, after having 2 weeks off on holiday, I start to notice that I'm struggling because...
Oh, that's so true. That is really true. I'm like, I really want the routine. And then I'm like, I'm so claustrophobic. I want some freedom. And then the routine. And so it goes on for the rest of my life. But yeah, sorry, carry on.
No, that's so true. But and I think part of my journey has been learning how to balance that.
Yeah.
Because I think I can go too far in either direction, and I've really struggled to find where that middle ground is. So I think we need to also be mindful of not over giving ourselves too much structure and routine as well, because we can then really wear ourselves out and we've got no capacity to help ourselves think in a different way or engage in skills. But I think 2020 overall, well, we know that anxiety and low mood and difficulties have increased for people, which is completely, you know, we could have predicted and understood that as soon as lockdown began. So people have been, you know, even if people weren't necessarily anxious about COVID itself, they may have been anxious about losing jobs. Yeah. Or the quickly changing kind of political environment, you know, the US elections, changes in church, how we meet. I think 2020 has been one of those times, probably once in a lifetime moments, where we really do get that sense of, I'm not actually in control here of the future of my life or the future of the country, or whether or not I stay healthy. And so I think people who may not have struggled in the past may have suddenly noticed they're really struggling now. You know, even if they weren't anxious particularly about any of those things, but they've been furloughed and they've lost their routine and sense of purpose. So yeah, I think a big time for anxiety and lots of difficulties, I guess.
There are, and I guess I don't want to make a positive out of something that's negative and difficult, but I appreciate and I'm grateful for we're in a place in history where we're talking about these things, where we're being open about how we feel and not just kind of keeping calm and carrying on and all that kind of thing. We're talking about it, we're being open about it. There's lots of great resources and stuff. So thank you. I love that. I would just talk about this for ages, and I keep looking down. And the reason I'm looking down is because I'm looking at my notes of the questions I said I was going to ask you, because I keep going off track. So I'm like, oh, let's talk about this.
I think often when you start talking, particularly about mental health and particularly about anxiety, again, where it's just like our thoughts, they travel quickly, don't we? And in our conversation about them, we move, don't we? We move about and shift about.
Oh, definitely. And there's so many things that I relate to, and there's so many things that I feel just this brilliant sense of hopefulness about for people who might be listening who think, this is a struggle for me. I'm finding it hard. I'm finding myself in the fight flight stuff a lot of the time. That even just noticing that I had went to this brilliant training course a while ago by a woman called Carolyn, who is going to come on the podcast soon. She's just amazing. She's brilliantly informed around trauma and dealing with trauma and shame and all that kind of stuff. And she was talking about when she was going through her therapy, her therapist used to say to her that her super weapon was just notice. Just notice, like when you're feeling the kind of, I always feel it in my chest when I feel that kind of heavy chest feeling, or I guess like you said, when you're in the car, you realize that your thoughts are going out of control. If you just notice, you switch out of one part of your brain into the other part of the brain, and you can begin the process of kind of grounding yourself and thinking different thoughts.
Absolutely.
And again, just to bring it back to the thing that we're passionate about is God and faith, that I love the verse of being transformed by the renewing of your mind.
Yes.
When you change the way you think, it can transform you, can't it?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, one of the things that really helped me during my journey. So obviously I was having CBT and I was learning a lot of new skills, but I also kind of developed my own mantra, I guess. And over the years, my theology has changed and my relationship with God has changed. And I think when I first became a Christian, I really felt that if I love God and God loves me, nothing bad's ever going to happen. And so when bad things did happen, then I'm like, oh my gosh, that's really shaken my belief. What now? But I guess as that shifted, and I've kind of acknowledged that God loves us, all of us. He loves us and he loves the cosmos. He loves the world. And that actually, big picture, when I zoom out, everything is going to be okay. And so I kind of developed a mantra where I would think about God and think about his hands around me and around the world. And I'd just say to myself in a very slow, I'd take that deep breath and say slowly to myself in a calm voice, everything's going to be okay. And even that had, which, you know, I could never predict I'd be very skeptical and cynical that would have any impact on my well-being at all, but it really did. So that connection, and God he wants the best for us. And although there is suffering and bad things happen, one day everything will be okay.
Yeah. Massively comforting thought, like really comforting. And I love that idea of zooming out, because we get so focused on our little stuff, don't we, on our stuff, what's going on in our thoughts. If we can kind of just zoom out to a bigger view, again, that in itself can just bring this deep sense of peace. So we're coming to the end of our conversation. Unfortunately, we can carry it on another time, just me and you. But I loved what you said about curiosity. I didn't even really ever think about curiosity being this kind of antidote to anxiety. But tell me, what are you curious about? What's piquing your curiosity at the minute?
At the moment, now, interestingly, relates to anxiety. But I guess in coming out of this season, in coming to the end of 2020, you know, we potentially got a vaccine for COVID, and we're all hoping and praying that we can go back to some sense of normality, I guess, in the spring, summer. And I guess what I'm curious about, and I've had to battle with kind of anxiety on one hand about the bad things that could happen and what could go wrong, and the curiosity on the other hand of what our new normal could be. And I know people have said, oh, I don't want a new normal. But actually, I'm really excited and kind of curious about the things that we may have learned about ourselves and one another and society as a whole during this kind of really challenging time, that we may be able to take forward after we finished our protective pause, as Sally Lovely.
You love that phrase. That's brilliant, isn't it?
Brilliant phrase. But when this is all over, like, I'm really curious about what the new normal will be, and how we can take what we've learned from today into the next season.
I love that. And again, that feels really hopeful. How can we redeem what's been a difficult, weird, strange, bizarre testing year? How can we kind of glean all the good stuff out of it, gather up all the bits of treasure that we've learned, and how can we take it forward to build something beautiful and new? I love that idea. I love your curiosity. I love how you're just so interested in gathering this information, but not just for yourself, that then you disseminate it, you share it with people, you use it to bring light and hope and truth into people's lives. So thanks so much for joining us, Laura. If people want to get in contact with you off the back of this conversation, what's the best way for them to do that?
I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram, so just my name, Laura Edwards. You should be able to find me. I'm on your friends list, Jo, aren't I? So if people
are indeed.
And I'm always happy to answer messages and respond, and I'm good at signposting. So, you know, feel free to contact me.
That's amazing. That's great. And on the video, if you are watching it on YouTube, down here we'll put all the links and stuff so you can access this. And if you're listening via the podcast, just type Laura Edwards into Facebook and see where you get. And I'm sure you will find her eventually. But thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for giving us your time and your expertise. We're really grateful for you. You're a real gift to the world. Keep being curious.
Thank you so much, Jo. Thank you for having me, and thank you for providing this beautiful space for us to explore lots of ideas. And really,
it's such a pleasure. It's a massive pleasure. Thank you to everyone that's listened in or watched in, and join us next time for the next episode of the Curiosity Conversation.